вас вітати на нашому заході. Це вже другий захід, який ми організовуємо із компанією Dev-Institute і спільно з лісовою службою США для того, щоб розібратися, як працюють моделі I3. І сьогодні ми познайомимося з новим інструментом. Ми вже з вами багато говорили про різні інструменти I3, такі як I3 Eco, I3 Canopy, I3 My3 та інші. А сьогодні ми в процесі, коли ми з вами спілкувалися, ми зрозуміли, що ми майже нічого не знаємо про I3 Research Suite. Тому ми, власне, дали запит в Dev-Institute, і вони погодилися вебінар щодо того, що це таке. І сьогодні ми з вами, власне, познайомимося детальніше і поговоримо також про моделі з гідрології, температурного режиму та зеленої інфраструктури. Але перш ніж ми перейдемо до змістовної частини, я хочу узгодити деякі технічні моменти, оскільки в нас захід відбувається двомовний, спікерка в нас буде робити презентацію англійською мовою. Не всі, можливо, добре розуміють англійську, тому в нас є функція перекладу синхронного. На вашій панелі навігації ви можете знайти, вона у вас може трошки відрізнятися. Там, де у вас реакції, у вас має з'явитися такий глобус, і там пише interpretation чи переклад. Коли ви натиснете на цю кнопку, ви можете побачити там дві мови, українська чи англійська. Якщо вам окей слухати англійською, ви можете нічого не вибирати, але, відповідно, якщо вам не окей, тоді ви вибираєте ту мову, яка є зручна. Також у нас є деякі люди, які є зі Штатів, так, тобто які є англомовні, аналогічно вони можуть вибрати собі переклад англійський. Так? То, будь ласка, знайдіть цю кнопку і виберіть ту мову, яка для вас підходить. Перш ніж ми перейдемо до вебінару, хотілося б трошки розказати про наш ПРОПРИ. Наш проєкт «Прозора та партисипативна система інвентаризації зелених зон в Україні», або, як скорочено, ми його знаємо, I3FOUA, впроваджується вже третій рік в Україні, і, відповідно, нашою основною метою є забезпечити повну функціональність інструментів I3 для повного використання в усіх громадах України, для того, щоб люди могли оцінювати екосистемні послуги дерев, використовувати це як інструмент адвокації, поширення обізнаності і так далі. І, відповідно, цей проєкт здійснюється за фінансовою підтримкою US Forestry Service International Program, тобто Державної лісової служби США. Минулого року ми працювали з різними громадами в Україні, зокрема, ми обирали 4 пілотні громади, враховуючи, що минулого року в нас почалася війна, то ми обирали громади, які суто знаходяться на заході країни, і знизували зелені зони в своїх громадах. І за минулий рік саме з цими 4 громадами нам вдалося залучити близько 250 волонтерів до навчання. Було оцінено більше, ніж 800 екосистемні послуги, більше, ніж 800 дерев. І, відповідно, цього року ми трошки переформатували наш проект, так, тобто змінили трошки нашу направленість, і ми провели такі 2 набори Всеукраїнської академії I3FOUA. Можливо, серед вас є випускники цієї академії, на якій ви познайомилися з інструментами, і, відповідно, на цю академію було дуже велика кількість реєстрацій, це 244, але не всі змогли успішно захистити, на жаль, виконати всі завдання, отримати сертифікати. Лише 45 студентів отримали такі сертифікати, і самим успішним ми дарували ось такі набори для інвентаризації, які вони вже успішно використовують, і, відповідно, на наших там ресурсах ви час від часу можете побачити там на Фейсбуці, наприклад, так, такі звіти по цих інвентаризаціях з різних куточків України. А сьогодні ми, відповідно, як я вже казала, познайомимося трошки детальніше з інструментами i3 Research Suite. І я хочу представити вам нашу спікерку. Це Джей Хепплер. Вона працює в Dev Institute і, відповідно, вона є там спеціалістом, працює з тими моделями, зокрема, їх розробляє, дуже добре знає. І сьогодні теж трошки познайомить нас ближче з цією програмою. Отже, я згортаю свою презентацію. Jay, now you can to share your presentation and to continue. Okay, thank you.
Look good?
Yes, everything okay.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, we'll get right into it. Good evening, and thank you everyone for joining me to discuss the i3 Research Suite on this Friday evening. Thank you to my team that is here, that has taken time out of their morning to be here. I have heard a lot about the great work Ukraine has been doing with i3, and I'm honored to present the Research Suite by the request of Alina. A little bit about me. My name is Jay Hepplер. I am the Research Suite specialist on our team. You may see me in the support email of i3, but the majority of my work is grant projects and working with graduate and PhD candidates to use the Research Suite. I've worked closely with Dr. Theodore Endreny, who's the lead developer of the Research Suite, since I was his student at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. To give you an outline for the presentation, first I'll give an overview of the Research Suite, the models, and what data you need. Then we'll get into the details of what these tools can do, example projects, and what inputs and outputs to expect. We'll close out with a little guide on exploring the test cases and going over where to access more resources. We'll spend the rest of that time on questions, and I am available by email anytime for follow-up questions. You'll see it a few more times, but I have my email down in the bottom right-hand corner, and I am a resource if you are interested in these models. So what is the i3 Research Suite? For those unfamiliar with the other i3 tools, it's a little bit different from our core tools. Our purpose is twofold. First, we aim to share cutting-edge environmental models with advanced users through research papers and our free models. And second, we aim to make sure each model in the suite is consistent and uniform in its science. The Research Suite began from i3's research and development, particularly in building out hydrology calculations for other tools. Over time, the Research Suite has expanded because of the work of Dr. Theodore Endreny and the ambitions of his graduate students. And this all comes from a place of care for human and environmental health. And it's important to understand that the Research Suite is different from the core tools in some key ways. It's designed for people with strong knowledge in environmental science and computer skills. It operates from a command line interface, not a graphic one. There is only limited free support available, but specialized help is available at a cost. And for more on this, I have my email and info@i3tools.org, which is the general i3 email. So what tools are in the Research Suite? The Research Suite comes in a zip format, and once you unzip it, you'll see a list of models. This can be broadly divided into two categories: hydrology and temperature models. In the realm of hydrology, the Research Suite has Hydro, which is our statistically based hydrology model with calculations focusing on vegetative impacts on runoff. Hydro is also notable for its ability to incorporate green infrastructure implements, which we'll look at later. Another tool is Buffer. Currently in a beta, Buffer serves as the nutrient hotspot mapping tool, been under development since 2003 with multiple iterations available. Our latest version uses land use, soil, and topographic data to identify regions with high concentrations of pollutants. Then we have our temperature models. First is Cool River, which is a one-dimensional river temperature model, allowing for the examination of how urban projects, riverbank shading, and river restoration efforts, among other things, can influence river temperature. And our other temperature model is Cool Air, an air temperature model that uses hydro's water budget with energy equations. This model aims to quantify the heat mitigating impacts of tree canopies, especially in urban settings. Originating in 2013, Cool Air has been increasingly capturing interest as global awareness is growing around the implications of extreme heat. Now, the data requirements are a bit different for each tool, so let's compare them side by side. Starting with hydro, our longest run and most frequently used model, the inputs are the most straightforward. At its most basic, hydro requires a digital elevation model, otherwise known as a DEM, and weather data. The weather data does require pre-processing by the user, but these steps are available in our technical manual. Hydro also has been used a lot internationally. Moving to Cool Air, this model demands a bit more in terms of data. In addition to a DEM and weather data, Cool Air requires raster files for land cover, tree cover, and impervious cover. This tool does require GIS software and expertise because all of the outputs are map-based, and Cool Air also has been used internationally. There are some conversions that are required, but we'll look at those together when we look at Cool Air. Regarding Buffer and Cool River, these models have not been used internationally yet. Nonetheless, they are both in stages of development aimed at broadening accessibility on a global scale. If you're interested in utilizing either of these tools, you can contact me directly to discuss the adjustments necessary for your use case. And last, I'd like to direct your attention to some valuable resources available on the website, which we'll also look at later. The iTree Research Suite webpage has the technical manual and some presentations. This is also where you'll find the download link and uses and citations for each tool. The website is a great resource that I encourage you to utilize if you choose to explore these models. So we will begin with our most accessible, longest running model, Hydro. Hydro is our hydrology model designed to simulate the impacts of landscape features like tree and impervious cover on hourly water runoff and quality. If you've been an iTree user for some time, the bottom left graphic might look familiar to you. Hydro used to be a downloadable tool with an interface just like iTree Eco. We stopped development on this tool as we shifted to the Research Suite, but it is a great foundation for understanding Hydro if you're familiar with it. And you may wonder how Hydro is different from other iTree hydrology calculations. Well, Hydro shares a lot of the same general equations as the other iTree tools, such as Eco. However, Hydro is not designed to analyze the impact of a tree or a group of trees. Rather, it takes inputs of the land characteristics and topography to calculate runoff. Hydro's strength comes from examining how landscape-wide interventions, such as green roofs or increased tree canopy, can mitigate runoff. And last, another feature that's different with Hydro is the ability to put in custom weather data. Other iTree tools come with pre-processed data, whereas Hydro enables you to use your own. While this does take more time, it allows you to use custom time series, design storms, and the most recent weather that is available. Let's look at a well-known model of Hydro that shows what the model's equations are considering. When you use Hydro, you input data like the weather, land type, and details about the soil and water. During a rain event, hydro will consider many factors. Here are just some key points. We have canopy interception. Given the user-defined leaf area, tree cover, and time of year, hydro will estimate how much rainwater will be intercepted by tree leaves. Depression storage and impervious runoff. Hydro will calculate the amount of rainwater that collects in depressions, like on rooftops or sidewalks, and then also can identify the point that runoff begins. Infiltration. Hydro will assess the capacity of pervious surfaces to absorb water. This is where advanced parameters such as soil porosity come into play. We have soil moisture, where the model will consider the initial soil moisture levels, as well as when the most recent rain event was, to determine if the soil can be more saturated. We have pervious runoff, where hydro will then calculate if the pervious runoff encounters impervious surfaces or perhaps goes straight into a body of water. We have various evaporations. Within all the processes, hydro estimates the rate of evaporation for impervious, pervious, and vegetative surfaces separately. And last, we also look at the subsurface runoff and topographical influences to determine where water goes. And these are just some of the factors that hydro will address, and then hydro provides outputs in text format. This data can then be further analyzed to give valuable insights into the water quantity and quality. And as promised, we'll also look at the green infrastructure implements in hydro. Hydro supports a few different green infrastructure components as illustrated in these diagrams. This includes rain gardens, permeable pavement, roof disconnections, and green roofs, among other things. And this graphic here is a great way to illustrate how green infrastructure fits within the larger hydro framework. In hydro's computations, green infrastructure is treated as its own hydrology unit within the larger area. It has the same soil and water parameters that the project area does, along with the specialized variables for each infrastructure. A percent of the total area, the contributing area, flows through the green infrastructure, which treats and slows runoff. We will revisit this graphic later with an example project. So let's pivot to look at some of the uses of hydro. Researchers and academics are key users of hydro. The tool's flexibility allows for remote case studies of any city, enabling researchers to manipulate variables like soil properties or tree canopy to assess the impact on stormwater management. This also facilitates studies of green infrastructures in urban environments. And the Research Suite's detailed outputs provide great options for users for interpretation or further analysis of the data. Urban planners and hydrologists also find hydro useful for broad-scale evaluations. Studies have examined how land uses such as forests, agricultural fields, or urban areas influence runoff quantity and quality. Information on pollutant loading is provided in hydro and expanded upon in buffer. Hydro has been instrumental also in advocating for increased tree canopy in urban areas, especially in a water management context. So let's look at some example projects that use outputs from iTree Hydro. A study conducted by my colleagues focused on the land cover impacts on runoff and quality in the Great Lakes subbasins. The Great Lakes has considerable effort with multiple federal agencies and research initiatives. We took advantage of that in this study by looking at 30 subbasins that drained into the Great Lakes. A range of land cover types were simulated from 0 to 100% for both tree and impervious cover. And this setup allows for an examination of how varying levels of each of these land types can affect runoff. So to orient you, the graph on the top left here shows that as impervious cover increases, impervious area flow and stream flow both increase. Tree cover on the bottom left doesn't have much impact in runoff. And combining the two of them together, we're able to create this image on the right, a 3D representation of how land cover changes will affect the runoff as a percentage. This white diamond here in the center symbolizes the current land use for more context. Let's look at another case study that was done to simulate a management scenario during a storm. Using Hydro's capabilities to input custom weather files, studies can simulate how an area can cope with a 25 or 50-year storm. Design storms are especially of growing interest with increases in extreme weather. And the last study we'll look at was in Hungary on the bottom here, comparing two urban areas. We have S1, or this light blue on the left bars, which is a dense array of low-rise buildings, and S2 on the right side, these darker bars, which is an outer housing estate with more open spaces and mid-rise buildings. Using Hydro, they compared the efficacy of underground rainwater harvesting systems. And the results revealed that the area with a larger tree canopy, the outer housing estate, had superior water management to the dense array of low-rise buildings. Such findings are crucial for informing future urban planning and development projects. So this is one last example on the green infrastructure outputs here, where a project area in 2018 had runoff of 2,083 cubic meters. When a bioretention cell was put in, there was a 32% decrease in runoff. Of course, not all of the runoff over an area goes to the green infrastructure. In this case, about 25% of the original runoff remained unaffected. However, the remainder was treated and stored within the bioretention cell, resulting in slower treated outflow and overall lower runoff. So now that we are familiar with Hydro and its applications, let's look at the data required to run the model. We have a digital elevation model. Often available in raster format, it will be converted into a text file. We recommend this to be between 10 and 300 meter resolution. We have weather files, files for radiation, weather, and evaporation. How to create these files is outlined in the Research Suite manual, but one other consideration is our source for this weather files tend to lack in international precipitation. Depending on the station chosen, you may need to integrate the precipitation separately, which we have a script and directions for in that zip file. And optional files here include pollutants and a stream gauge for calibration. Pollutants just contains a pollutant coefficients, which are assumed by the model if they're not given. And the stream gauge calibrations can be used for calibration. And although useful, this approach is being phased out due to the expense and data accessibility issues associated with these stream gauges. So now I'm going to take a minute to look at the one we didn't cover, which is this Hydro Plus config. In iTree Hydro and all the Research Suite tools, Hydro Plus config serves as the central hub for project metadata and adjustable configurations. Let's briefly look at its structure. For our project metadata, we have things like the output folder path and the model selection and an option for extended outputs. This is where you'll set the time that you're running as well as your area also. And then we have data organizers and folders. This is where the main model settings reside. Each data folder operates as an individual area that contributes to the overall area. So if green infrastructure is part of your project, you'll have its own data. You'll have a data folder just for that with corresponding characteristics. And one thing to note with this scary looking document is it is not necessary to configure all of the fields. These initial parameters here, which include information about the land type and the directly connected impervious area, should be specialized for your use case. For other variables, we try to set them as globally representative as possible, especially in a temperate climate that's similar to the United States. And the outputs can be broken down into default and extended outputs. Default outputs are a general archive of the simulation parameters and water budget summaries with a time series of runoff. Extended outputs provide more fine-tuned details, extending the range of time series data to include different land covers. All of these outputs come in CSV formats for easy analysis. So to review what we just covered about our first tool, iTree Hydro, it is a statistical model estimating the effects of tree and impervious cover on runoff quality and quantity. It can be used in quantifying land use impacts on runoff, identifying green infrastructure locations, and creating management plans for urban stormwater. And it requires a digital elevation model, weather data, and the HydroPlus config file. Now we'll move on to our next hydrology tool, which is iTree Buffer. iTree Buffer is a spatially distributed non-point source model that simulates the effects of land use, topography, and export coefficients to identify a subbasin's nutrient hotspots. We can do this for nitrogen, phosphorus, and total suspended solids. And note, this tool is currently in beta, so it is not downloadable from the website, but if you're interested, you can reach out to me. So we're going to look at another conceptual model, this time showing the relationship between inflow, a pixel of interest, and outflow. When I talk about this pixel from here on out, it's in relation to this yellow pixel in the center. Here are some things that Buffer will consider in its calculations. It will consider the runoff into the pixel of interest. It will consider the intensity, duration, and characteristics of the water coming into the pixel, as well as the water quality. And then we will, after going through the pixel, it will look at buffering, what the pixel itself contributes to the water quality, and where the water is going next. And then we examine the outflow. We look at the magnitude of runoff and its quality at the drainage point of the subbasin. So let's look at some uses for this tool and what projects can be done with it. Again, academics and researchers can conduct in-depth analyses on how water and pollutants accumulate in landscapes and how it influences buffering. Buffer can be a great addition to studies done with HECRAS, the Stormwater Management Model, or Hydro. Water resource managers and environmental planners can use Buffer to visualize landscape features most responsible for pollutant loading. This can also allow for targeted interventions in these subbasins or integrated into reports for public dissemination. And last, policymakers have found utility with Buffer's outputs in planning areas for remediation efforts, further studies, or increased funding. This is a great tool to remotely identify these hotspots that can then be followed up with in-person measurements, observations, and actions. For our example project, we'll look at the work by my colleagues in the Great Lakes again. After model calibration, Buffer was used to map hotspots of phosphorus, nitrogen, and suspended solids across these 30 watersheds. And as you can see, each watershed has a unique layout, topography, drainage, and land use, which results in these varied loads and hotspots. And these blue stars that you can see on the corners indicate the outflow points, which adds greater context to the proximity of hotspots to the drainage points. So now we'll look at the inputs for Buffer. First, we have our mandatory inputs, our digital elevation model, which is the same as Hydro. In this case, the finer the resolution, the better. Export coefficients. These represent the average total amount of pollutant loaded annually into a system. Across the United States, we have basin-level export coefficients across multiple land types and percentiles. While this is only developed in the US right now, we do have averages that can be used, or the data can be adapted for international locations. And then our last mandatory one is our land cover data. This is a file that is typically broken down by the United States land cover database classes, but there is the option to convert your global or local land cover data sets into these classes. We'll look at that when we look at cool air. And continuing on, we have a few different optional files, including soil data and stream gauge data. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have multiple iterations of buffer that we're working on. We're going through a big semester of development with this. So by next year, there will be a section in the manual that's dedicated to buffer, its different modes, and the inputs and outputs for each. And looking closer at the config file, the same project metadata is maintained. And then the next category we'll look at is temporal loading parameters. These get a bit complicated, so I won't get too into it, but you can see some of the model configurations that we have here. It includes river length, the delivery ratio, or active storage days. Moving on to our spatial parameters. We have the selection of an algorithm and the spatial weighing of pollutants. And again, we try to set these to agreeable defaults so you can play around with the model and you don't have to worry about adjusting too many variables. And this is a model that also requires experience with geospatial data because all of the outputs will be in a map format. For our default outputs, we have flow accumulation and the export coefficients for our pollutants. The extended outputs will give you all of the in-between calculations, rise in slope, water velocity, and filtering capacity, among other calculations. So to summarize what we just went over with buffer, it's a beta nutrient hotspot model focused on understanding the effects of land use and topography on nutrient hotspots. The tool caters for identifying pollutant hotspots and understanding the movement and storage of key nutrients. And the required inputs are a digital elevation model, land cover data, and export coefficients with US averages available. Moving forward, we have Cool River, which is the first of our temperature model, but also very much a hydrology model. iTree Cool River is our one-dimensional river temperature model, simulating the effect of urban development or stream restoration efforts on river temperature. This is one of our more intensive input programs that uses station measurements of river morphology and flow. It also considers factors around the river, such as urban development and riparian shading. For researchers and graduate students, Cool Air offers a platform to look at the details of urban development or restoration efforts and their impacts on river ecosystems. It can also be used as validation with another model or in comparison to real-time measurements. Water managers can find Cool River useful in monitoring temporal shifts in the stream bed and can inform strategies to mitigate these elevated river temperatures. And on the policy front, Cool River can inform regulations on land use and water quality. The model's outputs enable policymakers to make well-rounded planning decisions, particularly with river restoration. In this study, my colleagues used the iTree Cool River model to simulate various scenarios for the Los Angeles River. They looked at the impacts of different land use changes like infiltrating treated wastewater, introducing riffle pool bed forms, adding riparian forest, or expanding the floodplain forest. The study found that strategic interventions could significantly lower water temperatures and improve the water quality. By combining the treatments, they achieved a temperature drop of over 7 degrees Celsius and increased dissolved oxygen levels up to 14.5%. This can highlight the power of these multifaceted ecological restorations in urban waterways. iTree Cool River inputs require a high level of detail and collection, with stream morphology and groundwater observations as a time series being a required input. If you're interested in learning more about these detailed outputs, there is a Cool River manual, as well as information about Cool River in our general technical manual. Other requirements are more of the same from other models, are digital elevation model, weather data, and precipitation data. And some of the config variables we look at are time intervals, the latitude and longitude, and Manning roughness. All of these have comments in the green that are well defined, and we continue to change and grow the naming and types of parameters we have as we attempt to make the tool more accessible. And outputs for Cool River are in a time series for shortwave radiation, temperature, latent energy, and more and more. These can be processed using Excel, R, or another statistical viewer to create your comprehensive outputs. So to review what we've learned about Cool River, it is a river temperature model simulating the effects of urban development, river restoration, and inflow conditions on river temperature. Potential users could use it for studying river health, seeking a model to track river conditions over time, and in the advocacy of urban river restoration. And it requires inputs of stream and bed substrate, weather inputs, and monitoring station recordings. Moving on to our last model, we will look at our air temperature model, Cool Air. Cool Air simulates the effects of tree, impervious, and land cover on air temperature and water and energy budgets. Its strength lies particularly in the ability to assess the urban heat island effect and quantify the benefits of urban canopy. This model recently has been garnering international attention due to the growing need for heat mitigation. iTree Cool Air is used primarily in academic and research settings to quantify the urban heat island effect and its impact on human health and well-being. iTree Cool Air has been used to look at the impacts of trees on air temperature or mapping the hottest areas of a city to prioritize tree plantings. iTree Cool Air, while requiring knowledge of GIS, also provides the opportunity to use your own high-resolution rasters. Planners and climate change experts have had interest in Cool Air in mapping urban heat islands and running this under future climate change scenarios or land cover change scenarios to quantify heat risk. This risk can be used in long-term planning related to heat mortality. For our example project, I want to look at a project done by Rocco Pace, who is currently a postdoc at KIT in Germany. He worked with Dr. Ted Endreny to integrate Copernicus land cover data into the iTree Cool Air model, resulting in the first published international use of Cool Air. His inputs are as follows. We have B, the digital elevation model, C, tree cover, D, impervious cover, E, the Copernicus land cover data, and F, his converted NLCD layer. Rocco started by establishing a baseline scenario with 0 tree canopy across the entire city. This can be compared to the current tree canopy runs to assess the heat mitigating effects of trees. Following this, he altered the current canopy to explore what would happen with a 10% increase or 10% decrease in tree cover. Let's look at some of the outputs that Rocco generated for this study. Here on the left, we have a map of the temperature variation. On the right, we have the minimum, average, and maximum temperatures recorded. We have spring and autumn on the left here and summer on the right for both of these. And you can immediately notice that in this dense area circled on the lower left, the main city part of Naples has little temperature variation and the highest temperatures overall. And when you put temperature next to the map of land cover, impervious cover, and tree cover, you can really see how they all interact. Key takeaways being that these largely developed areas have less temperature variation, but higher overall temperatures, and that the land, tree, and impervious cover clearly have influence in the temperature extremes. So what is needed to run this model? There are more raster files required, however, a lot of this data is available from online sources. First is the same elevation model from our other tools, recommended to be between 30 and 300 meters. We have raw weather data and precipitation, the same as in the iTree hydro model. And where cool air varies is its impervious, tree, and land cover inputs. In the United States, we use these at a 30-meter resolution, using the classifications shown in the lower left. For your data, you would follow Rocco's process of using Copernicus or another land cover source and resampling to these classes. Also required is a tree cover and impervious cover raster. Both represent the cover between 0 and 100. All of these are resampled to be the same resolution and transformed into a text file for cool air. One other consideration that is more important in cool air is the memory availability. iTree Cool Air is memory intensive and can run at most a 300 by 300 grid. A quadrant approach is often needed to run any large-scale projects where you split up your project area and set up quadrants and then merge the final results together. This process is outlined in the manual. And looking at the config file for this, the metadata will be the same, and you will also have that same data folder that was shown with hydro because they share the same hydrology calculations. Some other fields will be location parameters taken directly from your land cover file, execution parameters that has reference weather station info, and information about the time results you want, and our calculation parameters. This is everything from the experimental resistance function to the width of roads to the height of buildings. And as always, variables are set to an agreeable default to allow for easy use, especially in the calculation parameters. And the outputs, once again, are default and extended. The output is maps for each hour that you ask the program to print results for. Also included is the same hourly water budget info that would be available in hydro. On the extended outputs, we have heat fluxes, latent energy, and net radiation per hour for each land type. Also included will be absolute humidity and dew point. And I'm not going to stick on this too long because I know we're running up on time, but these are just an example of some of the outputs that you can make with cool air, running multiple different land cover scenarios to see how it changes over time. And to conclude our introduction to cool air, I want to review our main points. That cool air is a spatial model estimating the effects of tree, impervious, and land cover on the air temperature and urban heat island effect. And it's used in quantifying heat mitigation from urban canopy, identifying priority planting locations, and studying changes in heat over time. And it requires inputs of a digital elevation model, land cover rasters, and hourly weather data. So now that we have reviewed all of these tools very quickly, where do we begin? You will begin by downloading this zip on the website, and you'll be met with this folder structure that has a Hydro Plus folder and a testing files and script folder. I'm going to show you how you'll interact with all this in a second, but just going down the line with the testing files and script and test cases, you'll see the model listings. It's a bit different from how I've explained it, but you can walk that stat hydro is iTree hydro. And after you select your model, you will be met with an input, output, and expected output folder. I'm going to show you how you'll interact with all of these now. So I have my I just unzipped this. I have a Hydro Plus and a testing files and script folder. Open up in that window there. I'm going to open up the Hydro Plus folder, go into the release folder, and that's the location of my hydroplus.exe. Going into my test cases, I'm going to go to Hydro, select my routing, and go into my input folder. Here I find HydroPlus config opened in a text editor. I have Notepad++ open here. I need to change the output folder path to be my local output folder. I'm going to copy that over, save my changes. Now going back to the input folder, I'm going to pull up my command prompt. I typed CMD on my start line there. And now I'm going to follow in the directions, copy the path of HydroPlus, paste that in, and then I'm going to copy the path to the input folder. Model's going to give me some metadata, and then it's going to start running. Now I can see my output folder. I have new results generating. It's showing me the time steps and the model completed. And now I can compare my output to the expected output folder to make sure that everything aligns. So directions for what I just went over and a lot more are in the technical manual located on the Research Suite website. This is where you can find descriptions of the configuration variables. Another useful part of the manual is these extended output definitions that will give you information on the headers and acronyms used in the outputs. There are also some troubleshooting tips and common input errors. The appendices have instructions on preparing the digital elevation models and the land cover files and obtaining and processing weather data. The manual will be your first line of defense for walking yourself through the program to understand it. But again, I am also a resource for anyone interested in using these models. And that is my introduction to the Research Suite. Thank you for the time and attention for the past 40 minutes. I know it is dense, but I hope you have walked away feeling like you understand the Research Suite a bit more and its applications. And again, my name is Jay, and my email is right on the screen. And if any questions or interests come up after the Q&A session, I welcome you to reach out to me. I am now available for any questions.
Thank you very much. Колеги, чи є в когось запитання?
I have a question, if I may. Do you hear me well? Hi. So I have a question about I3 cool air. So as far as I understand, temperature is generated only in Kelvin. Is it right?
Sorry?
Temperature parameters, they are generated only in Kelvin, not in Celsius.
Yes, it's in Kelvin, but it can be converted to Celsius.
Yeah. And then in that example that you were showing, so tree cover scenarios, like if to increase tree cover for 10% or decrease for 10%, and then see the effect. So is it like average tree cover? Yes. So it's like you pick one territory and then it's like average increase by 10%.
Yes. So how we set up these tree increases and decreases is we lay the land cover and the tree cover layers on top of each other. So anywhere that the land cover has water or wetlands, we do not change the tree temperature. But in urban areas, like that would be classes 21 through 24, we will increase or decrease that and then set, you know, a maximum of 100 or a minimum of 0, depending on the scenario.
Okay, so it targets only that classified land surfaces that can contain trees in a way.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Чи є ще в когось запитання?
Та особи нема.
Є ще в когось запитання?
Maybe I will ask one more question about I3 cool air. Have you tried to compare this like modeling with any other existing ones?
Yes.
I mean, based on GIS like layers, because like you can basically compare like different territories in the same area in terms of tree coverage and then temperature layer, and then like calculate the coefficients to see the difference, and then to use it as a super simple model. And I'm sure there are more like of different like model options. And what is the unique with your tool?
So we have compared cool air to, for example, the Landsat satellite calculations of the temperature. The main thing with cool air is that it takes into account a lot of the tree canopy and vegetative processes, as opposed to just whatever the surface temperature is reflecting back. And it is run at so the temperature given is actually done at like a, hold on, I'm gonna reword that, give me a second. Yes, so we have vegetative processes that are modeled more in cool air, and it is able to, we've done a lot of studies that have had actual air temperature recordings that we will then validate to the model. And we've adjusted that over the years, but we have very good agreement with the actual recorded temperatures. So I think really where cool air can especially excel is with this high resolution data where you can actually have just a street that you look at, and you can look at the temperatures on sidewalks compared to the roads, compared to somewhere that there is a tree.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Чи є ще в когось запитання?
А я можу українською своє питання задати?
Так, звичайно.
Мене перекладуть? Спасибі. Можете повторити, будь ласка, про той момент, тобто які інструменти доступні для використання інтернаціонального і які, чим будуть відрізнятись, ну, тобто як змінити модель, чим будуть відрізнятись моделі, ну, наприклад, для Cool тобто при використанні у різних країнах, тобто чи це потрібні якісь додаткові вхідні дані, тобто
So for adapting your data, that would depend on the tool, and something that I would encourage you to reach out to me personally about. But again, the tools that have been used internationally already, so the steps are pretty well outlined, is hydro and cool air here. We have instructions in the manual. The main differences with international versus United States data is going to be, if you're using cool air, you will be converting land cover classes from whatever your local land use data set is into United States ones. And the second will be if your weather station, which the weather stations are available globally. We do it through NOAA, NOAA. But if the precipitation is not always available, so you will have to input that separately, which we have a script for and instructions for as well. And you may need to adjust other variables like leaf on, leaf off, or local leaf area values, but that is something that we can talk about together to figure out what would be needed for your use case.
Спасибі, це є відповідь на моє питання.
Чи є ще в когось запитання? Лише маленьке уточнення. Тобто в менюалі ми можемо знайти всі кроки, як запустити модель, тобто як завантажити вихідні дані, як їх підготувати, і потім як використовувати для того, щоб запустити моделі. Правильно?
Yes.
Окей, thank you. Чи є ще в когось запитання? Добре. Якщо немає, тоді всім дуже дякуємо. Дякуємо, Джей, за те, що знайшла час доєднатися, пояснити нам, познайомити нас трошечки із новою для нас новим інструментом. Я сподіваюся, що всі колеги трошки познайомляться ближче, можливо, в них виникнуть в подальшому якісь запитання, так, можливо, хтось спробує там завантажити і використати цю програму для своїх цілей, і тоді, можливо, будуть ще додаткові питання. Якщо будуть питання, будемо пробувати звертатися, якщо можна.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for your time. And again, I am a resource to anyone that is interested in using these tools more. Thank you again for the invite today.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. It was very useful and interesting for us. So we will try this new tool, and I suppose that we will back to you with new questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Колеги, якщо ні в кого немає запитань, то це все. Дякуємо, що знайшли час доєднатися до нас. Дякуємо, Джей. Дякуємо всім. Можливо, хтось ще хоче щось сказати, чи щось додати, чи запитати. Добре, тоді дякуємо всім колегам.